In 18th-century England, not every family story turned on courtship and heirs. Many households were held together by single adults who managed budgets, cared for nieces and nephews, and kept the letters and ledgers that became a family's memory. Their lives were both social and practical. Music in the parlor, trips on the Thames, decisions made around a shared table rather than an altar. When we shift our view from marriage and descent to the bonds among siblings and cousins, we see a different map of kinship. It is lateral, durable, and it shapes how families work. In today's episode of Reunion, we explore that world through Amy Harris's Being Single in Georgian England, Families, Households, and the Unmarried, a study of the Sharp family across 3 generations that shows how unmarried kin shaped household economies, caregiving, philanthropy, and abolitionist work. It asks us to see aunts and uncles and single siblings as central actors in family governance and legacy. It also suggests genealogy is about values as much as it is property, and invites us to read portraits, epitaphs, and paper trails for the stories that single people preserved. Amy Harris joins us to discuss single sociability, householding beyond marriage, and how recentering lateral kin changes what family history can do. Welcome to Reunion, a podcast about how family history helps us understand the past and why it still matters today. This series is sponsored by the Center for Family History and Genealogy and the Family History program at Brigham Young University, which offers the world's only undergraduate degree in family history. I'm Joey Stewart, and I'm here with my co-host and colleague Christopher Jones. We're both assistant professors of history and faculty in BYU's Family History program. In each episode, we talk with scholars, educators, and storytellers who use family history to explore big questions about religion, race, kinship, and identity. Studying families helps us see what mattered most to people in the past and how those values shape the world we live in now. Family history is more than names and dates. It is a way to explore memory, emotion, power, connection, and belonging. It gives historians a flexible method for understanding everything from slavery and migration to religious conversion and cultural memory. This is Reunion. We're glad you're here.
Amy Harris is a professor of history and the director of the Family History program at Brigham Young University. A specialist in 18th-century Britain, she is the author of Siblinghood and Social Relations in Georgian England, and more recently, Being Single in Georgian England. She's also an accredited genealogist and a champion of using family history to teach empathy and historical methods. We're delighted to have you here, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
I'll get us started with a question. Both of your academic monographs, Siblinghood and Social Relations in Georgian England, and more recently, Being Single in Georgian England, foreground siblings and cousins to rethink what family meant for single adults in the long 18th century. What does viewing kinship laterally rather than vertically, that is through marriage and descent, reveal that standard marital or family models obscure?
So I would say one of the things is even if somebody is married and has heirs, they still inhabit lateral kinship their whole life. They're still cousins. They're still siblings. They're still children usually too. So if we only look at family as hierarchical, it just reifies what we think we already know about the early modern past, particularly in Britain. Oh, it's all top down. This is how things function politically, socially, and in families. And if you start to look at families in all their other connections that have lots of power and influence even on those hierarchical ones, then you have to reconsider a whole slew of social relationships. What other lateral ties affect politics, economic decisions, social, religious decisions? So that's the 10,000-foot level. And it also makes us reconsider how power and resources flow within families themselves, how contingent these decisions are. Even in a time when the married male householder has more power, it is not absolute power.
One of the things that I often encounter when I tell colleagues that I teach family history and genealogy is they'll say, oh, I've seen my family tree, or I've seen a fan chart. And I immediately think in my head, oh, that is the result of hundreds or maybe thousands of hours of work being put together in a way that does not really display the full richness of human relationships. And I'm thinking in particular about the Sharps, who you cover in your second book, who left an unusually rich paper trail. Which classes of records, such as letters, account books, wills, parish or probate materials, proved most decisive for reconstructing singlehood within these kinship networks? And how did these sources shape your interpretive choices?
I think if we take the beginning of your question about pedigrees and trees that just show you lineal descent, church registers, birth, marriage, death, that is a kind of skeleton I use. But the difference is if you can put that in a timeline instead of a frozen event. I do this all the time. I put the family in a timeline so that when I'm reading a letter from 1798, I know who's alive in the family in 1798. I know who's recently died, who's engaged, who's just had a baby, so that that letter has a broader kinship contours to it. So I was thinking about this, about which of these records is kind of the most robust for fleshing out family history or understanding kinship better. It's probably probate, which most people would think, well, that's patrilineal descent of property, but probate's bigger than that. And a whole lot of women left wills and other legal apparatus that deals with property. And it's the material culture that gets accidentally exposed. You see family values, what they're preserving from previous generations, what they want the current generation to pass on, particularly women and particularly single people's wills, because single people aren't thinking about, well, who's getting my property that's a lineal descent. So they think creatively. And so you see all sorts of kinship, you see friendship, you see how material goods perpetuate family values or family goals or family interests over generations that have nothing to do with property or descent from the property-owning man.
We can look at these vital records. We can look at these documents that anyone who goes to a courthouse or has a family search or Ancestry.com account can access, but it takes some creativity to put them together. What goes on in your mind other than creating a timeline when you're trying to tell the full story of somebody's life through the documents that are available to you? What's your creative process look like?
I like that you think it's some cogent, coherent, mapped out experience. So the first book, I knew I was interested in siblings. And the reason I was interested in siblings is I'd read a bunch of history of family and it was all about marriage and a little bit about parenting. And I thought about my own family and I thought, that's not even half the story. And especially in the early modern period in Western Europe and Britain, where a lot of people don't marry at all or they marry late, that's definitely not the full story. So I knew I wanted siblings, so I went to the archive and it was literally a card catalog because their online catalog was not detailed enough. And so I pulled out the card catalog section for diaries. And I read the description in anyone that looked like it had siblings. And that's how I found the Sharps. I mean, they're just all over the place in the Sharp records. And then I just systematically went through all those diaries. So I think the approach is thinking, okay, how do families live now? What kind of questions can I bring to documents that haven't had to answer that kind of question before? And one of the from my first book, the travel families are central. And I fell in love with them. And one of the sisters marries a kind of local gentry in Oxfordshire. And I found a printed book catalog of the Witts family papers. And I go to the archivist and I say, these aren't in the archive. Where are they? And he said, oh, we cataloged for them, but they're in private hands out in the countryside. But he's usually happy to have scholars come and look. So I arranged to get out to this little village called Upper Slaughter. So the descendant of the family has an 8 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet safe in his house, as one does, where he stored the family papers back to the 17th century. So he had his great-great-whatever grandmother's diary that was the sister of the stuff I was discovering in the county archives. And he said, yeah, she kept a diary every day for, oh my goodness, 30 years, 40 years. And he said, but I don't know who would ever care to read it. It's just about the weather. And I thought, okay, don't have a stroke in front of him. Don't start twitching about, I'm interested in also, women record different things. It's okay. He's since paid somebody to transcribe it and he published it. So he changed his mind at some point. But the idea that this could have no value beyond selling it to the university that does historical climate research baffled me. You just have to read differently. You just have to read looking for the other details. And she said stuff that told me about her relationships that she didn't come around and say, well, I was never close to so-and-so. It's clear. And I also knew the weather. So I get to say on the day that someone died, I'm like, it was raining. I know it was raining because Agnes wrote that down for me. So yeah, you have to just ask different questions. Women's historians have done this for 70 years, just reading against the grain.
I'm struck by your comment that it was your own experience of family that at least partially prompted you to think about some of these issues. And I'm reminded of an essay that you published in Wayfair magazine 2 years ago. It opens with this really great anecdote where an acquaintance who's seeking to get to know you better asks, do you have a family? And you quickly discern through a lifetime of experience that what he or she is really asking is, are you married? Do you have children? Tell me who you live with. And instead you respond, yes, I have a family. And I'm going to quote from it here. I then proceeded to rattle off details about my parents, 8 siblings, 4 siblings-in-law, 12 nieces and nephews, 2 nieces-in-law, and the imminent arrival of my first great-nephew. A short but awkward pause followed. She had not expected my answer and wasn't quite sure of her footing. I don't recall which of us spoke first, but we pivoted and moved on in the conversation. She should feel lucky I didn't also mention my 110 first cousins or how I had inherited 2 centuries tradition of childless aunts being adored by their families, to say nothing of the fact that you could have also gone on and on about your ancestors as a historian and a genealogist. And I think that's a kind of revealing anecdote to think that if somebody had asked one of the Sharp siblings about their family, after reading your book, I'm convinced that they would have been just as likely to rattle off details about their siblings and one another and their nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles and their parents as they would about their spouse and children, for those that were married. Obviously, for those that were single, to think more capaciously than at least we do often about families, both contemporary and historical. But I wonder about how representative a family like the Sharps were. So when teaching family history, and I know this from previous conversations with both of you, we each try and encourage students to think about the individual families they research and to write about them as part of the world in which they lived, to think about them as illustrating some broader trend in the era. So how did you balance this micro-historical family history approach with claims about Georgian singlehood writ large, and what evidentiary thresholds did you set to move from a single case to a pattern or a trend?
So I try to be honest, first off, that these are exceptional people. This is not an every family 18th century. But what I think what microhistory can do is this is what was possible for the 18th century. So sometimes when we was trying to balance grace and accountability for figures in the past, and we say, well, they were a product of their time. I like something that shows up. Could they have gone this far? Is this how far they could go? These people were fighting press gangs and enslavement, right? They also were incredibly sexist and racist. You can see the limits of tempered racism that at least recognized slavery was bad. And classist. They were very elitist, and especially when it came to music. But so I don't try to make them in every family, but I hope that it comes across in certain sections that there's patterns here that other families would recognize. Now, first off, just demographically, a lot of people don't marry. And also, socially, family is a much more fungible category than it is for us. So people would have assumed if you're an adult man and running a household, you have a wife and children, right? And you might have to dispel them of that myth if you didn't. But there's this great book called Friends and Family by Naomi Tadmore, where she talks about how those terms were used differently in 18th century Britain. And friend is a kind of a higher status in some ways because that's family that helps you. But family can mean household, right? And it can mean step and half and adopted and biological and all those sorts of things. So I think because so many families have high rates of unmarried and because infant mortality is high, and so a lot of people are widowed or have blended families, then what the Sharps experienced, they had all the resources to have the very best version of it, which also smooths any conflict as well that other families experience, that shows these patterns are possible. So I would try to keep my eye on, do I know this from some other family I've studied? Do I know some piece of this? And I have a family, not my family, but there's a family in rural Sussex that are contemporaneous with the Sharps' nieces. And there's 18 of them, 11 or 12 make it to adulthood, or 9 of them never marry. And they stay on this small little cluster of few acres farms in rural Sussex. They could not be more different than the Sharps. But I see him doing some of the same thing where family finances and marital choices and sibling relations are in a kind of messy arrangement. And there's no letters from these people, but I can kind of interpret, okay, you need the labor of those unmarried siblings to make these farms work at the economic level you are, because that's incredibly unusual in the 18th century to have that many children. Incredibly unusual. And their mom also outlived their dad by like 20 years. So there's some of that, but I think it also dampened their marital prospects because there's some level of function in those relationships because they stay co-resident. They care for nephews like I see the Sharps doing as siblings die or become indigent. They leave property to each other, so the last living sibling ends up with all the remnants of that. So I see echoes of what the Sharps are able to do at this kind of very comfortable, wealthy level. The Pratts of rural Sussex are pulling off in a different way. I try to keep in mind all the conflicts most families interacted with that the Sharps navigated better, partially because of financial prosperity, partially because of family culture. I would see echoes and I would think, okay, what do I know about household overall from probate records or someone who studied probate records and how single women leave their property to other single women? What do I know about the demographics of how infant mortality changes birth order configurations? So yeah, they're not in every family, but they're a pattern of what a lot of families would have experienced, especially if it's a family that has adult late to marry or never marry. If it's a family where everyone marries by 25 or 26, less of that's going to be familiar. But chances are they have an uncle or an aunt they depend on. So there'd be elements of that in other.
You bring up something that I try to review with my students, which is that everything you find should either align or not align with an expectation that you have. You can make a historical argument because it either represents broader trends that's going on or it stands against those trends. And so it just seems really important to me that you're seeing these two families functioning in very different ways. I also think in my own family, my brother is the one that we plan out Thanksgiving dessert with. But when it comes to buying Christmas presents, it's my sister and I that tend to plan and then distribute things to everyone else. So there's no one set way of doing things. And in your chapter, Living Single, you show how unmarried siblings share these burdens or these responsibilities with household and familial care and decision-making. Could you walk us through a concrete case study where single householding altered inheritance planning or caregiving expectations or other sort of legal expectations for the family?
So first, household's a really important category in the early modern world as a marker of adulthood, as a status as a class and financial status marker. And so in a lot of ways, single people in the 18th century, particularly for women, they become misses at some point because they're a mistress of a household or they're a mistress of an institution. And it doesn't really become associated with marital status till the 19th century. And so there's the notion that running this household is this important marker of being an adult, right? And is deeply satisfying to both men and women. And I like to remind people that the origin of the word economy actually comes from the Greek word for house, and house economy initially meant household economy, how households function. So you asked about concrete example of how the single people affected household economies or household governance. So for the Sharps, because they marry late or are yet to marry, they shape their whole family's household cultures, partially because a bunch of them don't have children right away. Because even when they do marry, they have really horrific infant mortality rates in their family, at way beyond even the normal for the 18th century. So they don't have nieces and nephews that start to disrupt that. So they establish patterns for decades that then the nieces and nephews have to adapt to. But the single folks, so there's 6 or 7 single Sharps hanging out in London together, and they have concert at their own house every Sunday, a sacred music one. And then there's music nights during the week. And then in the summer, they sail up and down their little flotilla of ships on the Thames, putting on concert, again, as one does. And they go out to concerts by themselves. And I would be intimidated if I was the new violinist in that string quartet and in walks the 6 or 7 Sharps in all their finery and their musical snobbery to listen to you. So they establish all sorts of things about how those households are going to run. And again, they're exceptional. And at some point, one of the brothers, William, buys a new house, and this is all in the center of London. He buys a new house that can host 300 to 400 people for a musical evening or a party. So William's into the sociality of everything. I have a study that's not in the book. I did later. I took 9,200 households from the 1851 census. I wanted co-resident siblings who were born before 1785, so I could get some 18th century siblings and kind of see the long stretch of households. And so 9,200 sounds like a lot, but of course it's a drop in the bucket for the overall population of Britain or England in 1851. But it's still significant to see what it is and how many of those households had decades of co-resident siblings. So they're dictating a household structure before a sibling gets married. And it shapes marital decisions all the time. So one of the examples from the book is their oldest brother gets married in 1752. Now, he's a clergyman. It would be expected for him to have a wife. He's up north. She's their first cousin, so they've all known her forever. No problem. One of them tries to marry a first cousin once removed, but he dies of smallpox, so that doesn't come off. But so it's 10 years later that Elizabeth marries another first cousin once removed. This is one of the reasons they have a hard time getting married is endogamies, apparently. Because who's gonna dive into that family, right? How are you going to be cool enough and witty enough and musical enough to be in that family? Anyway.
You have to be in the family already, which presents its own issues.
Yes, right. This might affect the fertility problems they have. But Elizabeth gets married in 1762. They have no nieces and nephews until that year. And so there's just one up north with the brother up north. Elizabeth's down in London. She gets married in 1762. Since their parents had died in 57 and 58, she had been running the household for James, brother, very close to her age. We think of housewifery in a very negative light a lot of times. Oh, just a housewife, that kind of thing. Being a housekeeper at a household, like manager, that's an important social status for men and women. And so she's been running James's household. And I should point out that he's a major inventor, engineer, ironmonger. His factory and his house are right next to the East India Company offices. He's incredibly smart, wealthy. So she's running a big household, apprentices, servants, that kind of thing. She gets married. And I think it's not accidental that within 2.5 years of that, her two brothers get married because she's suddenly not the center of that household. So she moves out. Luckily, her husband is the heir to a big estate out in the countryside, of course. But now James, I think, looks around and goes, well, how am I supposed to run a household by myself? I got to have a partner. He recalculates about marriage. So there's this girl he likes. And I say girl because she's like 14 years younger than he is because he's in his late 30s at this point. She goes to riding lessons with his sister every day. And he always contrives in the most Jane Austen way possible. Some reason he needs to accompany them so he can flirt with Catherine. And he falls head over heels and he talks to his siblings about, what do you think about this girl? I'm thinking about making a move. What do you think? And he says to their older brother who's up north, he says, I will not pursue this if it disrupts what we have and our remarkable unanimity. So he would give up marriage if it had a negative influence on the sibling relations and household arrangements. They'd known for, since he and his brother moved down in 1740, whatever, to do apprenticeships. And they all reassure him. They actually say, make her spend some time with us so we see if she likes us, because we might be the problem, right? They're a little intimidating. And she's all in, right? They get married a few months later. She's a full sharp from then on. But he was not going to get married if the household arrangement set up from single siblinghood would it all be impacted. And then the next brother to get married gets married less than a year later to James's wife's in-law, right? So they're marrying into the connected families, who's also a Catherine. There's 4 Catherines, as you can expect. But I think that James getting married triggers William thinking, oh, but I got to find somebody that's not going to ruffle any feathers or disrupt the smooth flow of this family. And that's what he did.
Can you explain the embodied sensation you had when you read that line? Because it underscores your entire historical argument, and it seems like it would feel pretty incredible to read someone saying exactly what you were arguing, but they wrote it, several hundred years ago.
I like that you notice it's a moment I can tell you exactly where I was. So I'd been reading their papers for a long time because I found them initially working on the first book. And they're voluminous, right? So you don't read every word all the time, that kind of thing. So I'm sitting in a cubicle at the Newberry Library in Chicago to work on this book in this little cubicle. And it's March in Chicago, so it's the dead of winter. And it's cold and gray outside. And I know this. I know this is why I know they're making marital choices based on their pre-existing family structure. And that's obvious, right, from the behavior. And I'm reading the letter in my little cubicle. I'm like, I knew it. I knew this is what you're doing. Thank you, James. Thanks for backing me up with an explicit statement. This is the calculation I'm making in my head.
I'm only mildly disappointed that none of my siblings approached me to seek my blessing and my opinion on those that they chose to marry. I'm just kidding. Callie and Ashley and Dane, I love you all. You're awesome if you're listening. I'm delighted to have you be part of our family and each of you make it better. So as I was reading your book, I thought not only about my relationships with my siblings and the historical subjects that I study and their relationship with their siblings, but also the place of aunts and uncles in families, of nieces and nephews. How does recognizing aunting and uncling, I don't know if those are actual words or not, as distinct life courses or as distinct roles, change our understanding of family memory and kin obligation?
So I will tell you that when I typed the word aunting for the first time, Microsoft Word was cool. When I typed uncling, that tells you everything you need to know about how we think about gender and family. So that was an epiphany for me too, where I talked about these folks for a long time. And there's so much scholarship about the early modern, the importance of uncles for apprenticeships and aunts taking, single aunts is kind of cliche and also based in historical record. Dalit Hemphill's book on American siblings has that chapter, The Reign of the Older Sister, right? So they're going to be there. And then I was looking around, there's nobody who'd written at that point any scholarship on aunts and uncles as aunts and uncles. They're always instrumental to the children or a support to the parent. And so I'm like, no. This is its own thing. Granville Sharp and Elizabeth Sharp have their own relationships with their nieces. They have their own dynamic. And the parents are cool with that. I mean, this is 18th century, so the parents are sending the nurse and the baby up, when it's 2 days old to spend 6 weeks with its aunt in the countryside. That was interesting to try to expose, okay, so what is different than being a parent? And so there's much less responsibility. And with that comes much more freedom in the relationship. And that's true for me as an aunt. Yeah, they're delightful. They can do whatever they want. But as the nieces, for the Sharps, and this wouldn't be true in every family, of course, but for the Sharps, the nieces over time, because there's only 3 of them that survive childhood, they morph into kind of little sisters for the younger end of the family, which is also the end of the family that has lower marriage rate. So it's not as hierarchical. It's already a little flattened out. It's kind of somewhere between sibling and parent. It comes with, like I said, more freedom to be affectionate and playful, supportive, give advice, and less worried about have we launched them appropriately for the world, even if the aunt and uncle is doing some of the instrumental work to launch them properly. The Sharps have this lovely little letter. So their oldest niece is born deaf, which they never say. But, I do a little scratching on some of the things they do say and you can figure it out. But when she's 4 or 5, and they're discussing her language is coming along at all. And all the uncles and aunts who are single down in London writing a group letter. They always did these group letters. I know the 18th century has a lot of these, but the Sharps take it 6 degrees higher all the time. They're writing a group letter that's going up to their brother and sister-in-law to remind you of their first cousin that they've bought gifts for Aunt Jemima, their little niece. And the one brother is so ticked off because the only thing left on the list of what they're getting is a little shift for her to wear. And he's like, darn it, why didn't I get to buy the fun stuff for her? I'm sure her mom will appreciate this, but she's not going to have any special feelings to the person who just bought her some clothing, why couldn't I buy her a toy? And that to me is not a parent or a sibling way of relating to that child at all, or a cousin. That's an uncle. So there's a playfulness. There's an enjoyment of the relationship because it doesn't come with that responsibility at the same level. There's an expectation that they will be responsible caregivers. And there's more freedom within cross-gendered association. So an uncle and a niece, instead of the sort of expectation that fathers and uncles are going to shape boys for the next generation, I think there's maybe a little more, we're just here for you. So there's less pressure to also help you prepare for your gendered adult role. But then they're in the Sharp, a lot of times aunts and uncles get described as if they're the surrogate parent that comes in when a parent's gone. And the Sharps themselves benefit from a cousin who acts kind of like an aunt for them when their parents go. That is true. But for them, the parents are still alive. So that would make a difference. I think in a family where the aunt and uncle takes in the child because the parents died, that is surrogate parenting, right? But when the parents are still alive, then they get to have their own aunt-uncle, niece-nephew relationship.
I love how you're asking us to think about intimate relationships beyond what is going to be legally kept in vital records or government or parish, church, religious records. But at the same time, I'm wondering about demographics and about the demography of your study and then also these families that you looked at in the 1851 census. Do lateral kin networks mute or magnify the social effects of singleness? Or put another way, does it reveal the types of relationships that can exist under singlehood? Or does it obscure in some ways? Does it point out to you why singlehood or singleness is often skipped over when folks are studying families or demographics over time?
I would say in some ways that in historical scholarship in early modern Britain, singleness has been less looked over than siblings. Siblings is obscured more than singleness. There's actually been quite a few books about, especially because so many people don't marry or they marry so late, particularly in the 17th century. I mean, it's sometimes 25, 30%. It's lower in the 18th century, more people marry in the 18th century. Because sometimes the history of families does life cycle singleness. So it says, here's a teenager that goes to an apprenticeship or domestic servants or university, whatever, depending on their social status. And then they meet somebody and they get married in their mid-20s, and then they have children, and then their children grow up, and then they die, right? But if you start from the perspective, what I was trying to do is, well, if I start from the perspective of someone who marries very late or doesn't marry at all, then it reconfigures that layout. And so I think what it does is it exposes all this other stuff going on, that if you're only focused on that 15-year-old will marry and have children, then you're missing out on all the other things that 15-year-old is embedded in, and that 25-year-old and that married 35-year-old is embedded in. So I think it actually, focusing on the single folks, exposes all this other stuff that's there. But when all you're seeing is a life cycle about marriage and childbearing, then you miss out on all those things that married and parent people are doing as well.
Are there folks in England who are worried about singleness or who are worried about siblings caring for themselves rather than entering into marriage relationships and or having kids? Like, are they worried about the population?
Not in the 18th century, no. There's still the stereotypes about the bachelor and the spinster and, the poor person who couldn't manage to get married or whatever it is. But they're not worried about demographic collapse because the English are experiencing the demographic transition of just huge population growth. So they're more worried about poor people marrying than single people not marrying. They don't want poor people to marry and have kids. There's always a critique. There is a critique always about celibacy or sexual repression or licentiousness that comes because marriage is supposed to be a dampening effect on licentious behavior. So there's those kind of moral panic kind of conversations, but not so much that we're not having children.
Your book suggests that single family members often stewarded collective memory, that they served as the keepers and preservers of family papers and other items. What does their role as curators and preservers of family papers tell us about genealogical self-understanding or self-fashioning?
Yeah, so the Sharps might be mildly exceptional, just how much is involved from the single people keeping those records because they don't have an estate. So if it's a family that has property like that has an estate, then married single doesn't matter, accumulates the papers there. And if I think about sort of my ancestors that were butchers and shoemakers and that kind of thing, they just don't have the space. So this is kind of a class thing. Although I do think there are other ways of seeing how people who can't retain all the documents do this kind of stuff, like naming patterns or small objects, right, that get passed down or something like that. So the Sharps are probably exceptional. At the record keeping they do, the single Sharps are maybe exceptional in that way because so many generations of them. It was actually kind of fun as a historian, you're writing a story, but they're real people for real records. And so you can't make up a plot point. But this worked out really well where the single Sharps of the 18th and early 19th century, including their niece, are the big record keepers. And then it's generations, sort of the 20th century and 21st century story, are never married, single, childless Lloyd Bakers at that point, who an uncle, never married childless uncle and a never married childless niece, collecting papers in the early 20th century and then depositing them in the county archive, echoing what Granville Sharp and his childless nieces did, right? Yeah, that's not a pattern I think I could replicate everywhere. But what looking at single people in genealogy more broadly made me think about is, so Elizabeth, the sister Elizabeth, she clearly kept a diary from when she was a teenager because there's a memoranda book she makes in the 1790s that you could not recreate the detail from the 1730s and 40s if you didn't have something to draw from. And then she and a couple of her siblings and a niece make this family lineage chart. I think it's about 4 feet by 8 feet backed cloth. So it folds up into sort of an A4 size. And it's not finished because it's hand-drawn and then hand-painted. Her sister Judith was an artist, so Judith did the painting. And Granville wrote the little story of the arms up at the top. But because Elizabeth doesn't have children, and most of her siblings do not, and because so many of them are never married, Elizabeth marries, but he dies after 5 years and they don't have any kids, and she never remarries. She doesn't do it the way a lot of folks in the 18th century would do it, where it would be, here's my lineage, and it's about, I'm going to tell you my female ancestors' names when they're close to me in generation, but I'm really going to be about the glory of the property-owning man or the prominent man. And then here's my children and my spouse, but I'm going to tell you way more about what my sons do, that kind of thing. She just starts in a whole different place, and she lists her siblings in a lateral line of little blue circles. And so many times official published or even hand, home-drawn things will have a little symbol, sort of these died without children, right? And they don't even have names, or they died as children. And so she has everyone listed, including siblings of hers that died before she was born. So that clearly there's been some record keeping internally. And they're in the middle of this chart, not at the end of it, not at the beginning. At the beginning, it's actually 4 family crests that all come to them from female lines, by the way. In the middle of the lineage chart, Elizabeth depicts her siblings and she in these blue circles. And it's this line of the 14 of them and then their parents, and then who married and one of their kids. And there's only, of all the siblings, there's only one niece that has children that outsurvive her. And so those are some of the circles towards the bottom. And I counted, and I should have looked this up to remember, but I think it goes down 3 generations, back 4 or 5, and out. We're talking about 3rd, 4th, 5th cousins, or some of them on the chart. So this is a whole lattice and a network, not a lineage per se. I'd love to do more on this because you need more examples to see how single people are thinking of this. But I think that shows me that being single, particularly not having children, you have to think differently about what's getting passed on, what's getting preserved. And clearly just being sharp is cool. So that's getting preserved. And so being part of that network is worth preserving because they're doing this in the 1790s when some of the siblings are gone. Elizabeth would have been in her 60s, childless, Granville about the same age. So their age has an impact, right? They're clearly thinking about, okay, what's going to outsurvive us that our niece will pass on to her children kind of thing. But you can see it in probate records, though. You can see it particularly in single people's probate where they're thinking about what have I inherited and what should be passed on that isn't just about property. That's about family identity. That's about the values our family holds. I mean, we've all talked about this because we've all read 100 books in the last few years about the history of genealogy and how genealogy and family history tell us about history. And, the British are often held up as this. It's always about aristocratic property owning things. And it's not just the Sharps. I see lots of other things going on that I think single folks might be thinking about this differently. Like a couple of clergymen I can think of who don't have children and one never marries. They're even thinking about how the church records themselves should preserve lineage for everybody, not just the wealthy. And I don't know if you get there if you're married and have children. I don't know if William Day gets there or Shute Barrington, in case you wondered. Yes, he was Bishop of Durham, and his name was Shute Barrington. I don't know if the Barrington registers and the Dade registers get created if you don't have childless men thinking about, well, what should be preserved for the future.
I love that reflection that you shared there, and it makes me think about something that you once wrote about something that you called genealogical consciousness. So you write that genealogical consciousness means seeing how past, present, and future are connected. Again, not in an abstract sense, but in the lived reality of actual thinking and feeling people, and how they and we are connected over time and space. This echoes an idea from Margaret Bendroth, the archivist of the Congregational Library, who wrote, "Instead of defining ourselves through associations with once famous people, or taking our ancestors too lightly by assuming they were not as complex as we are, we should want an encounter with the past that will challenge and deepen us." How have you seen this in your decade plus of teaching family history to undergraduates?
So this is particularly good to ask when I'm coming off a semester when I taught the very beginning introductory course. So it's an elective, but these are not majors and minors for the most part. So they're not thinking about careers. They're not thinking about what do I need to know so I can be successful in this program. They're curious about their family, and the university's going to let them take a university class to, write a biography of a great grandparent. Sure, right? And they consistently, this is true for the majors and minors as well, of course, they consistently discover grace. They consistently discover meaning, purpose, something beyond themselves that isn't about their anxieties of this moment. They discover perseverance. They also discover a lot of muddy stuff, right? And hard stuff. But they see themselves as part of a bigger project in some ways. And of course, we're in a context where that has a religious connotation, but the bigger project of just their family, right? Can they heal things in their family? And we've all talked about this. You've all been interviewed on these same. You've given talks on these same topics. Other people in our department have done similar. Just how they see themselves as responsible for healing or bringing to light things that had been wounding people in their family for generations. And they see themselves as not perpetuating that or building something better for the future. And so the real engagement with the records, the real engagement with the people, not just consuming Ancestry DNA kit results that, are 3 seconds away from being eugenic if you're not careful. They have real engagement with the historical past. They see it's contingent. They see, agency is a thing. It's also circumscribed by the circumstances of your life, but choices shape the future. I swim in the choices of my ancestors. Those are pretty deep things for an undergraduate who comes in thinking they're just going to write a pretty story about their great-great-grandpa that grew 4,000 bushels of corn one year. Those are fun. They catch that kind of historical and genealogical consciousness at the same time.
This is wonderful. We've spent a lot of time today talking about your scholarship and your books, and we appreciate you sharing with listeners more details about those and some additional thoughts on those. I'm wondering if there's a book that you've read recently that has ignited your historical imagination.
So I don't have a single book. I'm glad you prepped me for this question because I've been reading Adam Miller. So that's not historical. So I'm teaching British history next semester, and I haven't taught it in many years. And one of our colleagues is teaching the earlier part of British history this semester, and we've tried to make the classes kind of fit a little bit. He does high politics, right? And high church. And I'm like, how do people eat? And how do they decide to get married? So I've thought about, what can I do to frame what people are eating or how they're getting married in a national context? Because I teach a history of families and history of women. And so those aren't histories that have, well, on this date, this important thing happened that shaped all, it's more thematic. I mean, we go chronological, but we thematically deal with, family politics and family economics and those kind of things. So to teach a national history when I haven't done it for several years, I think, okay, what's the framework for that? And so the books, I have several books I've maybe read a long time ago or I haven't read yet. And so I'll just mention one of them because what I've decided the framework will be home and empire and how they're always implicated in each other, which is easy to do with history of Britain. But I mean, what people are wearing or eating is embedded in imperial systems, and what's going on in the empire is embedded in what's going on in the domestic spaces back in Britain. I've only read parts of The Inner Life of Empires by Emma Rothschild. That's right in this, and it's 18th century. So I'm excited to finish that one and see if that helps me with the framing. And then the other book that I read years ago I still love it, Daniel Livesey, Children of Uncertain Fortune, about Jamaica within the British Atlantic and how racial politics and property law shape who's related, what happens to them, what that means back home. And so that really lit me up. Good Atlantic history always makes me a better historian of Britain. And that book's a little too long to assign to a bunch of undergraduates, but I do use a case study of that in my British Methods class.
Thanks for joining us on Reunion. Family history isn't just about names and dates, it's about relationships and how those relationships have shaped laws, power, and the structures that govern our everyday lives. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really helps others find the show. We'll be back soon with more discussions about why family history matters, because family history is history.